The wind didn't just whisper through the northern plains that day. It howled. It carried the ghost smell of scorched timber and something metallic, something that stuck to the back of your throat. Blood. Smoke, thin and gray as a dying man's breath, curled from the skeletons of cabins. It drifted over broken fence lines, through cornfields burned black to the root. There were no birds, no crickets. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath, thick and heavy with ash. And in the very center of what used to be the Rosewood settlement, at the gate that once promised a new life, a girl was left to die. Her name was Clara May. She was 19. She hung from the main crossbeam, limp as a rag doll, her arms stretched high and bound with rough-cut rope. A dark, ugly stain of dried blood matted her hair, trailing a path down her temple to her collarbone. Her boots were gone. Her dress, once the color of a hopeful summer sky, was ripped and smeared with soot. Her chin was slumped to her chest. Anyone riding by would have thought her gone. But if you looked close, if you had the stomach for it, you'd see the smallest movement, the slow, shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was still breathing. Nailed to the post beside her, a crude sign dripped in red. Indian land. A handful of warriors watched from the square. Their horses tore at the few pathetic tufts of grass that had survived the fires. One of them, broad-shouldered with streaks of war paint still vivid on his cheeks, grunted at the man standing nearest the gate. "Leave her. Let them all see. This is what happens when they steal what is ours." Another, younger, shifted in his saddle. He couldn't look at the girl for more than a second. "She's just a girl, Lever." Lever's voice was like stone grinding on stone. "She wears the dress of a settler. She pays the price for her people." But a third man stepped forward. He hadn't spoken a word until now. He was leaner than the others, dressed in soft, worn buckskin. His hair was long and black, tied back with a simple strip of faded red cloth. His name was Tyen, and though he was Comanche, his eyes didn't hold the fire of vengeance that burned in the others. They held something else, something quiet and ancient, like a deep, still river. He looked up at Clara. Her lip was split clean through. Flies were already gathering at the edges of her wounds. And yet she held on, a stubborn, flickering flame in a storm of death. The warriors watched him. They knew that look. Tyen wasn't one for speeches, but his silence could be louder than any war cry. Lever turned his horse, his face a mask of contempt. "What are you doing, half-blood? Admiring your work?" Tyen's gaze didn't waver from the girl. "She's still breathing," he said, his voice low and calm. It cut through the tension like a clean knife. "Her people settled their debt in blood, but she is still human." Without another word, without waiting for permission he would never get, Tyen started walking toward the gate. He pulled a knife from the sheath on his belt. It was well kept, the blade clean and sharp. The younger warrior called out, his voice tight with warning. "Tyen, don't! Touch that rope, and you sever your place in the circle. Lever will not forgive this." Lever just watched, his hand resting on the hatchet at his side. A silent threat, a promise. Tyen didn't look back. He started to climb the main support beam of the gate. The charred wood groaned under his weight, showering him in fine black ash. He moved with a quiet, certain grace, like he was born to climb. He reached the crossbeam and paused, looking down at the girl. Just then a sliver of sunlight broke through the oppressive, ashen clouds. It hit Clara's face. One of her eyelids fluttered, a tiny, desperate movement. Then it closed again. That was all it took. Tyen's knife flashed once. The blade sliced through the thick rope with a single sharp pull. Clara dropped. She didn't hit the ground. Tyen caught her, his arms taking her weight as if she were nothing more than a feather. He held her for a moment, a strange tableau against the backdrop of ruin. The Comanche warrior and the settler girl, suspended between a violent past and an uncertain future. He climbed down slowly, cradling her like a wounded fawn. The wind picked up, lifting a strand of her blonde hair and brushing it against his cheek. Above them, the painted sign flapped once, a sharp, cracking sound in the dead silence. Then it was still. Lever spat into the dirt. He muttered something in his own tongue, a curse that was old and deep, but he didn't move to stop him. None of them did. There was a line, and for reasons only they understood, Tien had been allowed to cross it. For now. Tien walked. He walked right through the heart of the devastation, his moccasins silent on the ash-covered ground. He stepped over charred beams and the glittering shards of broken lives. He didn't look back. He found his horse tethered by the settlement's well, the water now choked with debris. He lowered Clara gently onto the bedroll, slung across the saddle, his movements precise and careful. He mounted up behind her, turning the horse not west, back toward the tribe, but east, toward the rising sun, toward nowhere. As they cleared the last of the ruined cabins, Clara began to stir. A low moan escaped her cracked lips. She tried to push herself up, but her body was a symphony of pain. Her voice was the rasp of dry bark on stone. "Let me go." Ten said nothing. He just kept riding. She managed to open her eyes, just a slit. She saw the buckskin, the long black hair, the dark skin of his profile against the gray sky, and the terror that had been simmering deep inside her exploded. It was a primal, mindless panic. She wasn't a person anymore. She was a cornered animal. She twisted violently, a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline. She fell from the horse, hitting the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud. The impact jarred every broken piece of her, but she didn't stop. She started to crawl, dragging her bruised, useless limbs toward the dark line of the woods. Tien dismounted in one fluid motion. He took a single step toward her. "No!" she rasped, scrambling backward like a crab, leaving streaks of dirt and blood behind her. "Don't!" Her hand closed around a loose stone, heavy and rough. She swung it weakly, a pathetic, clumsy arc that missed him by a foot. And then she looked right at him. Her eyes, which had been dull with pain, now blazed with a raw, broken fury. For the first time, her voice rose above a whisper, tearing from her throat. "Just kill me! You savages! You already took everything!" Her shoulders heaved with sobs that made no sound. Her hand, the one that held the rock, trembled uncontrollably. Then, as if a string had been cut inside her, she collapsed. The stone rolled from her limp fingers. Her head slumped forward into the dirt. Tien knelt beside her. He didn't touch the rock. He didn't look at her with anger or pity. He reached out and gently, so gently, brushed the dirt from her cheek. He looked at her not as a settler, not as an enemy, but as a human being who had been pushed past the edge of endurance. He lifted her again, his arms strong and secure around her broken body. He held her close, and his voice was a quiet whisper against her ear, a sound meant only for her. "You are not dead yet." And with that, he carried her away from the ashes and into the deep, dark woods. The stream was a secret, whispering its way through a dense stand of pines. The light here was different, filtered down through the canopy into a soft, green twilight. Tucked away beneath a rocky ridge, half swallowed by overgrown brush, was a place that time had forgotten. An old trapper's line shack, its timbers bleached by sun and scoured by wind, its roof a patchwork of bark and dried mud. It was the kind of place you could only find if you already knew it was there. This was where Tien brought her. Clara was a dead weight on the journey. Her head lolled against the saddle blanket, her breathing shallow. Tien didn't speak, didn't rush. He simply moved through the forest like he was a part of it. When they reached the shack, he lifted her down as if she were made of glass. He carried her inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light that pierced the gloom. He laid her on a low cot woven from grass and reeds, and the dust rose around them in a silent cloud. He worked with a quiet efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He built a small, smokeless fire in the stone hearth. He poured the last of the water from his canteen into a tin cup, soaked a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt, and began to gently clean the wounds on her face. When she woke, it was full dark. The only light came from the soft orange glow of the embers in the hearth. For a single blissful second, she didn't know where she was. Then memory came rushing back, a black tide of fire and pain. A man was sitting by the fire, a silhouette. An Indian, she screamed. The sound was thin and reedy, but it was sharp enough to cut the silence. She scrambled away from him, crab walking into the darkest corner of the small shack, her body screaming in protest. A fresh wave of pain flared in her ribs, so intense it made her vision swim. Tien didn't move toward her. He simply backed away, placing the cup of water and the damp cloth on the floor between them. He gave her space. Then without a word he turned and left the hut, going to sit by his own small fire outside. He let her breathe. She didn't sleep that night. Every shadow was a monster. Every creak of the old wood was the sound of a footstep. Neither did he. He sat by his fire, a silent, unmoving guardian, watching the stars wheel overhead. By morning, desperation had given her a false strength. Clara tried to leave. She stumbled out of the shack and down the small hill, her sights set on the dense woods. She made it 20 yards before her swollen ankle gave out. She went down hard, her face pressed into a bed of damp pine needles. When she came to, her dress was snagged on a thorn bush, and her arms felt like they were filled with lead. Tien appeared at her side as if from nowhere, a ghost in the morning mist. He crouched beside her. "Don't touch me," she rasped, her voice raw. He didn't. He just waited. He waited as she struggled, as she fought against her own broken body, until the pain became a fire that consumed her, leaving no room for fear or hate. When she could no longer draw a breath without a sob, she finally turned her face away in defeat. He lifted her again, his movements slow and steady. He carried her back to the shelter. He did not speak. He did not scold. He did not judge. The second time she tried to escape was at dusk. She was weaker this time, dizzier. She crawled, inch by painful inch, toward the sound of the whispering creek. She made it to the muddy bank before the world went black. He found her there, slumped half in the water, her hair fanned out like a pale halo in the mud. He carried her back. The third time she didn't even try. She just opened her eyes and found herself once again wrapped in the hide blanket, the warmth of the fire on her face. And the anger, the helpless, boiling rage spilled over. She threw the blanket off. "Why? Why won't you just kill me like the others? Or do whatever it is you're going to do? Just get it over with." Tien was sitting across from her, his legs crossed, his hands resting open on his knees. His face was calm, unreadable. "I didn't burn your home," he said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble. She stared at him, breathing hard, her chest tight. "But I saw who did." That stopped her cold. The air crackled. He held her gaze, and she saw for the first time that there was no malice in his eyes. There was something else, something heavy. "My people," he continued, the words coming out slow and deliberate. "Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne. They rode on your settlement. I will not lie to you about that." Her lip began to tremble. "If they took a home from you," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "then I will give one back." She flinched. The words hung in the air, a strange and terrifying offering. Was it kindness, or was it just another kind of cage? He rose slowly, his movements fluid and silent, and left the shack. A short while later, a new smell drifted in. Not the sharp scent of a wood fire, but the rich, savory aroma of broth. He returned holding a small clay bowl, steam curling from its rim. She was sitting up, her back pressed stiffly against the wall. Her wrist was swollen to twice its normal size, her fingers curled and stiff. She watched him with weary, suspicious eyes. He knelt beside her and offered the bowl. She didn't take it. She couldn't. Her hand wouldn't close. He noticed. He always noticed everything. Without a word, Tien dipped a carved wooden spoon into the broth. He blew on it gently, the gesture so simple, so unexpectedly tender, that it caught her off guard. He raised it to her lips. She hesitated, her jaw tight. Then something inside her gave way. The fight just drained out of her. She opened her mouth just enough. The first spoonful was rough going down her raw throat. The second was smoother. She coughed once, a dry, rattling sound, but she kept going. And as he fed her, spoonful by careful spoonful, she watched his face. She wasn't looking at a savage, not a monster, not an enemy. The fire of war was gone from his eyes if it had ever been there. In its place was something still and solid, something that had seen too much and said too little. Between sips, her voice was barely a whisper. "What's your name?" "Tien." She nodded once, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Her fingers, which had been clenched into a fist, slowly uncurled, gripping the edge of the blanket. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines. But inside the small, forgotten shack, for the first time in days, Clara closed her eyes. Not from pain, not from exhaustion, but from a strange, unfamiliar warmth that was pooling deep in her chest. It wasn't safety. Not yet. But for the first time, it felt like the shape of it. The days in the shelter under the ridge passed in a slow, healing rhythm. There were no clocks, no calendars. Time was measured by the slant of light through the cracks in the walls, by the deepening chill in the morning air. Clara's body mended itself in fragments. Bruises bloomed and faded from purple to a sickly yellow. Cuts sealed themselves into thin pink lines. Her trust, however, came much, much slower, if it came at all. A sudden crack of a branch in the woods would still make her jump. She still flinched if Tyann moved too quickly, but she no longer tried to run. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a weary, watchful curiosity. She watched him. He was a creature of silence, so quiet that at times she would forget he was even there, until she'd turn and find him sitting by the fire, his hands busy with some small task. He moved barefoot inside the small lodge. He never slammed the door, because it was just a hide flap. He never raised his voice. When he spoke, it was always brief, his English careful and deliberate, as if he were translating each word from a deeper, more thoughtful language. "Eat," he would say in the morning, placing a piece of warm, skillet-baked bread on a cloth near her cot. "Water," he'd murmur when he returned from the stream, his shoulders damp, handing her a cool bucket. One afternoon the sky grew dark and a distant roll of thunder echoed through the valley. Clara froze, curling into herself like a threatened snail, the sound too much like the roar of guns, the crack of fire. Tyann, seeing her terror, knelt beside her. He didn't touch her. He just placed his open palm flat on the dirt floor. "Safe," he said, his voice a low anchor in her sea of fear. "Not war." She looked at him, at his calm face, at the steady hand pressed against the earth. She didn't entirely believe him, but some deep, exhausted part of her desperately wanted to. He never pushed. He never hovered. He created a space for her to heal, and he respected its borders. Every morning he would rise before she did and leave a small offering by the door. A strip of jerky, a handful of late-season wild berries. Once, a strangely shaped root that, when boiled, made a sweet, calming tea. She never saw him place these things, but they were always there. Small, quiet truths in a world that had become a nightmare of lies. He slept by the hearth. She slept on the cot against the far wall. The distance between them was a silent agreement. One morning the mist was so thick it clung to the trees like a shroud. The air tasted of ash and damp earth. Clara stepped outside the shelter for a breath of crisp air and saw him. He was sitting on a large flat stone, hunched over a piece of wood no bigger than her forearm. His knife moved with a surgeon's care, not slicing, but peeling away thin curls of wood, shaping it. She watched him from the doorway, her arms folded against the chill. She didn't make a sound. Later that afternoon, he left to check his snares. Curiosity finally won out over her caution. She walked to the flat stone and looked at what he had been working on. It was a bird, or the beginning of one. Its wings were half spread, its head raised as if listening for a distant call. The carving was rough, unfinished, but it was incredibly alive. It felt like it was caught in the very moment of creation, halfway between being wood and taking flight. She reached out, her fingers tracing the delicate line of a wing. Then she pressed her thumb against an unfinished edge, feeling the faint warmth of the sun still trapped in the wood. That evening, he returned to find her sitting by the fire, the wooden bird held carefully in her lap. She didn't try to hide it. She just looked up at him, her expression open for the first time. Her voice was soft. "If you carve me wings, I'll try to fly." Ten didn't reply. He didn't have to, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of understanding that went deeper than words. The next day, she helped him gather firewood. It was an awkward, clumsy effort. Her ankle still throbbed, and her arms were weak, but she managed to carry a small bundle back to the lodge and set it by the hearth without falling. He watched her, but made no comment. His silence was a form of respect. He let her find her own strength. That night, a small piece of normalcy returned, a routine. She stirred the stew he was making while he chopped more roots. The moment was so quiet, so domestic, it felt like a dream. Then she accidentally knocked a small pouch of salt into the pot. A curse slipped out from under her breath, a word her mother would have washed her mouth out with soap for. Tyan glanced up from his chopping. He raised one dark eyebrow, and a dry, unexpected wit surfaced. "Bad magic," he said. Clara blinked, and then a sound she thought she had forgotten how to make bubbled up from her chest. A laugh. It was a short, startled thing, rusty from disuse, but it was real. Tyen tilted his head, and the corners of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest she had ever seen. They ate together that night, shoulder to shoulder in the warm glow of the firelight. The stew, now far too salty, smelled of wild onion and roasted rabbit. They didn't speak much, but the silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. When she burned her tongue on a hot piece of meat, he handed her a cup of cool water with a soft, amused grunt. When he forgot to stir the pot and the bottom scorched, she muttered, "Tastes like revenge." And he chuckled, a low, deep sound that seemed to surprise even him. Later, as they cleaned the bowls with handfuls of moss by the fire, she found the courage to ask a question that had been circling in her mind for days. "Why do you stay here? All alone?" Tyan paused, his hands still. He stared into the flames, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "Too many graves," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes holding a universe of pain. "Not mine." She nodded. She understood. That was enough. That night, as she lay on her cot, she looked at the carved bird he had placed on a small rock shelf across the room. Its wings were still unfinished, but for the first time, the sight of it made her chest ache, not with grief, but with something else. Something fragile and terrifying. Possibility. She didn't love him. She didn't even know him, and he had asked for nothing from her. But as she drifted off to sleep, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing from across the small room, she knew one thing for certain. For the first time since her world had burned to the ground, she felt less like a ghost and more like a girl again. A girl sitting by a fire, sharing a meal with a stranger who was slowly, inexplicably starting to feel less like a stranger and more like the only solid thing left in the world. And in the quiet space between them, a small, warm fire had been sparked. It wasn't loud or wild, but it was enough to hold back the cold. The cold came down from the hills without warning, a sharp-toothed wind that stripped the last of the leaves from the aspens. The fire inside the shelter became the center of their small universe, a crackling beacon against the encroaching dark. Clara sat by the hearth, a thick hide blanket wrapped around her. Tyen was beside her, his knife whispering against wood once more. The bird was changing, evolving. He had carved delicate feathers into its wings, each line a testament to a patience she couldn't comprehend. The bird looked more ready for flight now, more certain. The quiet between them had become comfortable, a shared space rather than an empty one. But tonight, Clara needed to fill it. She needed to give voice to the ghosts that haunted her. "They killed my parents," she said, her voice small, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire. She didn't look at him, just stared into the dancing flames. "It wasn't a battle. They just walked into the house. My father was at the stove. They shot him in the back. He didn't even see them coming." Tyen's hand stilled. The knife rested on the half-carved wood. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just listened. He gave her the gift of his stillness. "My mother screamed," Clara's voice wavered, but she pushed on. "They dragged her outside. I saw it through the window. They cut her throat." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "My sister, Lizzie, she was only 14. She tried to run. They caught her in the cornfield. They took her. I don't know if she's... I don't know." The words caught in her throat. "I was hiding," she whispered, her hands twisting the edge of the blanket in her lap. "In the root cellar. I watched it all through a crack in the floorboards. I watched them burn the Thompsons' cabin across the way. They were still inside. Mr. Thompson was trying to shield his baby. It didn't matter. They all burned." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes dry but glowing with a terrible, feverish light. They painted our door with my mother's blood. The smell, I can't forget the smell. Tien slowly, carefully set his carving and his knife aside. His voice, when it came, was as low and deep as the earth itself. I was not there, he said, but my people were. Clara said nothing, but her body stiffened. A wall went up between them again, invisible but solid. He let the silence sit for a long moment before he spoke again. I was taken when I was 5 years old, he said, his gaze distant, looking at a past only he could see. Not by settlers, by the Comanche. Her head tilted slightly. This was a story she hadn't expected. My real parents, I don't remember them. Just fire, screaming, and then nothing. A Comanche woman whose sons had been killed in a raid. She took me, raised me. I became her son. He leaned back against the wall of the shelter, his eyes tracing the smoke-stained timbers of the roof. But I was never one of them. Not truly. My skin was too light, my hair not dark enough. They said I had the eyes of a coyote, a spirit shifter. Untrustworthy. He paused. I learned to fight, to hunt, to ride better than any of them. I had to, but I never belonged. Why did they keep you? Clara asked softly. A hollow, mirthless smile touched Tien's lips. Because I survived. That made me useful. A good luck charm. A ghost who could walk in the white man's world. The pieces began to click into place for Clara. His quietness, his solitude. He was an exile in his own life. And why? She hesitated, the question heavy with unspoken meaning. Why did you help me? The question hung in the air between them, more important than any that had come before. Tien's gaze finally met hers. It wasn't evasive or distant. It was direct and filled with a stark, painful honesty. Because, he said, his voice so soft she had to lean in to hear it, if someone had cut my family down, if someone had shown them a moment of mercy, maybe I wouldn't be so good at being alone. The words landed not like an answer, but like an offering, a piece of his broken soul laid bare for her to see. It wasn't meant to win her over. It was just the truth. Clara looked down at her own hands, at the fingers still wrapped tightly in the hide blanket. Her chest ached with a sharp, unfamiliar pang. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. They were from different worlds, different blood. But the same fire had burned them both, leaving the same scars on their hearts. Slowly she stood up. She walked to the small pile of supplies Tien had gathered over the weeks. Scraps of leather, a spool of sinew, a tin of broken buttons. She knelt and sorted through it until she found a small, square piece of soft hide in a needle. She returned to the fire and sat down. Tien watched her, his expression unreadable, as she threaded the needle with slow, deliberate care. Her wrist still ached, and her fingers were clumsy. But she worked with a quiet determination, pushing the needle through the leather. Small, uneven stitches. She was making a handkerchief. A simple, rough thing. But she was making it. When she finished the border, she looked up at him. I never sewed anything before. My mother tried to teach me, but I was always too clumsy. He gave the smallest of shrugs, a gesture that was uniquely his. Looks whole to me. A real smile touched her lips, small but genuine. Then, without explanation, she took the needle again. With painstaking effort, she stitched one final thing into the corner. 5 blocky, uneven letters. Tyenne. She held it out to him. He didn't take it at first. He just looked at it, this small, imperfect thing, as if he didn't know what to do with it, as if no one had ever made anything for him before. It's not much, Clara said, her voice suddenly shy, but it's the first thing I've made that wasn't just for survival. He reached out and took the small piece of hide from her. He held it carefully, his rough fingers gentle against the uneven stitches, as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. He folded it once, then twice, and tucked it into a small pouch on his belt. Then, for the first time since the night he had cut her down from that terrible gate, he said her name. Clara. She met his eyes. And in that moment, they weren't a Comanche warrior and a settler girl. They weren't captor and captive. They were just two people, scarred by the same war, finding a moment of grace in the ruins. The quiet didn't last. It never does. The morning broke still and cold, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a storm. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, draping the trees in a ghostly white, muffling the world. Tyan had gone out at first light to check the snares he'd set by the ravine. Clara was by the fire, grinding acorns into meal with a smooth stone, humming a wordless hymn her mother used to sing. For a brief, fragile moment, it felt like peace. It felt like home. Then came the hoofbeats. They were soft at first, a distant, rhythmic murmur that you felt in the soles of your feet before you heard it with your ears. But Tyen, emerging from the wood line with two rabbits slung over his shoulder, felt them instantly. He froze, his body going tense, his head snapping up to stare east, into the impenetrable wall of fog. Clara stepped out of the shelter, the basket of acorn meal in her hand. "What is it?" He didn't answer. His eyes were narrowed, his focus absolute. And then they came. Figures materializing out of the mist like vengeful spirits. Bare-chested warriors on horseback, their skins streaked with fresh paint, the colors stark and brutal against the pale fog. They carried rifles and war clubs. They were his people, 6 of them in total. Their leader rode forward, reining his horse to a stop just feet from Tyen. It was Lever. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He didn't look at Clara. His gaze was locked on Tyen. "You are not forgotten, half-blood," Lever said in the Comanche tongue, his voice dripping with scorn. "And not forgiven." Tyen stood his ground, the dead rabbits hanging limp at his side. "I left the war behind, Lever." "You brought it with you," Lever snapped, finally flicking his eyes toward Clara, who stood frozen by the shelter door. "You hide what we marked for death. She was left for the crows and the wolves. You sheltered her." "She was not a wolf," Tyen answered, his voice dangerously calm. "She was a girl." Another warrior spurred his horse forward, his face contorted in a snarl of rage. "She is the stain that proves we did not finish the job. The spirits of our dead cry out for vengeance, and you give their killer comfort." In a single fluid motion, Tyen moved to stand directly in front of Clara, shielding her with his body. It was a clear, defiant choice. "You will not touch her," he said. The words were not a request. They were a law. Lever's men didn't wait for an order. 2 of them dismounted and rushed Tyen. One grabbed his shoulder. Tyen shook him off with a powerful shrug, and the clearing exploded into violence. They were on him in a blur of motion. They hit him with fists, with elbows, with the butt of a rifle. It wasn't a fight, it was a beating. Clara screamed as he went down to one knee, a smear of blood blooming on his cheekbone. But even then, even on his knees, he twisted his body to keep himself between her and them. "She is mine to protect," he roared, a sound of pure primal fury. "She is not yours to finish." But he was 1 man against 5. It was a fight he could never win. They dragged him away from Clara, his heels digging furrows in the soft earth. Lever dismounted and stood over him, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. "You chose this path, brother," Lever sneered. "You chose her over your people. Now she will watch you die for it." Even as they beat him, Tyen's eyes found Clara's. "Clara, run!" he shouted, his voice choked with pain. "Run!" And she did. But she didn't run blindly. As the warriors focused on Tyen, her mind, sharpened by weeks of survival, took over. She remembered the ravine, the small cave hidden behind a curtain of mossy rocks where Tyen had shown her a patch of medicinal herbs. She scrambled into the trees, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear the sickening thud of their blows, Tyen's grunts of pain. She didn't look back. She ran until her lungs burned, until she found the ravine. She crawled into the tiny cave, pressing herself back against the cold, damp stone, her hands clamped over her mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to betray her. Outside, the shouts and sounds of the beating slowly faded. She heard the horses move off. And then, an unnerving, absolute silence fell over the forest. She waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Her knees ached. Her heart felt like a block of ice in her chest. Finally, when she could bear the silence no longer, she crept out of the cave. She moved back toward the clearing like a ghost, expecting to find the worst. Tyen? She called, her voice a fragile whisper. She found him slumped by the cold fire pit. He was a broken heap, his face swollen and bruised, blood dried in a dark crust at his temple. His chest rose, but just barely. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking. She brushed the matted hair from his face. His eyelids fluttered open, struggling to focus on her. A ghost of a word formed on his bloody lips. You stayed. And then his eyes rolled back, and he went completely still. The days that followed were a blur of fear and desperate work. Clara, the girl who had been too clumsy to sew, became a nurse, a hunter, a protector. Tyen's fever climbed, a raging fire that threatened to consume him from the inside out. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in his own language, his body racked with tremors. He called out names she didn't know, and he called hers, over and over. Clara. She tried everything she had learned from him. She kept cool cloths on his head. She brewed a bitter tea from willow bark. She crushed herbs into a poultice, just as he had shown her. But nothing worked. The fever held him in its grip. On the fifth morning, she knew she was losing him. Hollowed out with exhaustion and fear, she made a choice. She packed the small leather satchel he always carried with a water skin and some dried meat. She tied his knife to her waist, and she left him. She plunged into the deep woods back toward the ruin of her home. It was a journey into a nightmare, but she didn't hesitate. She pushed through thorny thickets that tore at her clothes and skin. She dug for roots at the edge of streams with her bare bleeding hands. A rattlesnake coiled and hissed at her from under a rock. She didn't even scream, just skirted it and kept moving. She was no longer the frightened girl. She was a woman with a purpose. By the time she returned to the shelter, night had fallen. Tyen hadn't moved. His breathing was so shallow she had to put her ear to his chest to hear it. She worked by firelight, boiling the plants and roots she had gathered, things her mother had used for fevers, remedies from a life that felt 1,000 years ago. She forced the bitter liquid between his lips, spoonful by spoonful. She wiped the sweat from his brow, and as she worked, she sang to him, the same wordless hymn she'd been humming that fateful morning, a song of comfort, a prayer. "Stay with me," she whispered, her hand gripping his. "Please, just stay." At dawn, as the first pale light filtered through the trees, something shifted. The trembling in his limbs subsided. The terrible heat radiating from his skin began to cool. His fever had broken. He opened his eyes. They were tired, bloodshot, but they were clear. He looked at her dirt-streaked face and tangled hair. "You came back," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "I never left," she said, and the tears she had held back for so long finally fell, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. He closed his eyes again, but this time it was not the stillness of unconsciousness. It was the quiet of a man who had been to the edge of death and been pulled back. It was peace. Tyen woke to the smell of smoke. Not the acrid, terrifying smoke of a burning settlement, but the soft, herbal scent of healing leaves smoldering over a low fire. The fire itself crackled gently in the stone pit, casting a warm, orange glow across the wooden walls of the shelter. His body was a map of dull, throbbing aches, but the raging fire inside him was gone. He was alive. He turned his head slowly. Clara was sitting by the hearth, her knees drawn up to her chest, the hide blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders as if she were the one who was cold. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess. Her face was pale and smudged with dirt, but her eyes were wide open, staring into the flames, refusing to sleep. As he watched, her chin dipped once, twice, as she fought a losing battle with exhaustion. She didn't notice he was awake until he shifted, the movement sending a sharp reminder of pain through his ribs. Her head jerked up, her eyes startled. Then they met his. He tried to speak, but his lips were cracked and his throat felt like it was lined with sand. He didn't have to. The question was in his eyes. She leaned forward, her movements stiff with fatigue. She poured water from a tin cup and brought it to his mouth, supporting his head with her free hand. He drank slowly, the cool water a blessing. When he finished, she set the cup down and gently dabbed his forehead with a damp cloth. "You stayed," he managed to rasp, his voice barely a breath. Clara didn't smile. The ordeal had worn away everything but a core of grim determination. She just nodded. He closed his eyes again, letting the warmth of the fire and the simple fact of her presence anchor him to the world. "I thought," he began, but she cut him off softly. "I know." She shifted closer, her voice low but certain. "You kept calling my name, even when you could barely breathe." Tian opened his eyes again. The firelight carved new lines into her face, making her seem older, harder. But the fear was gone. The flinching, cornered animal look had been replaced by a quiet strength that seemed forged in the very fires that had tried to destroy them. "I could hear it," she added, almost to herself. "Even when I was hiding in the cave. Even when I was so afraid I couldn't move. I could hear you." He didn't ask her why she had come back. He didn't have to. The answer was in the exhausted slope of her shoulders, in the fierce protectiveness of her gaze. She had returned not out of debt, but out of a shared humanity that was more powerful than tribe or color. In the days that followed, his strength crept back, a slow tide returning to a barren shore. Clara tended to him with a focused, no-nonsense tenderness. She brought him broth. She changed the poultices on his wounds. She helped him sit up when the pain in his ribs became too much to bear. She never once mentioned leaving. And then something new began. Every morning when Clara woke, she would find a small object placed just outside the shelter's hide-flap door. The first day, it was a single hawk feather, long and silver gray, tucked neatly into a folded strip of leather. The second day, it was a small, crudely made clay pot, filled with rich earth. A tiny green sprout, no bigger than her thumbnail, was already breaking through the soil, its roots carefully wrapped in damp moss. The third, a smooth, flat river stone. Etched into its surface were two birds. One had its wings wide open, soaring. The other was perched right beside it, watching. And then one morning, as the first rays of dawn lit the clearing in gold, she found it. The wooden bird. It was finished. The wings were fully spread, the chest lifted, the head turned slightly as if catching the wind. Every line was perfect, smooth and full of life. It sat on the flat stone where he used to work, waiting for her in the morning light. She picked it up. It felt warm in her hands. She ran her fingers over the grooves he had carved, feeling each delicate stroke. This wasn't just wood. It was a promise. It was a piece of his soul. When she brought it inside, Tien was awake. He was sitting fully upright for the first time, the hide blanket draped over his shoulders. Their eyes met across the small space, and this time, there were no more questions between them. There was no more fear. She placed the bird gently on the rock shelf above the hearth, where it looked as though it might launch itself into flight. Then she went and sat beside him, not close enough to touch, but close enough to share the same air, the same warmth from the fire. Her silence said everything. She hadn't stayed for him. She had stayed for them. This wasn't a rescue anymore. This wasn't repayment. This was a choice. Two broken people from two broken worlds choosing to build something new, together, in the quiet heart of the wilderness. The house they built wasn't grand. It had no glass in its windows, only stretched and oiled hide that let in a soft, milky light. The floors were packed earth, and they creaked in a dozen different places. But it was strong. It stood firm on the ridge above the stream, its walls made of thick-cut logs that Tien had notched and fitted with painstaking precision. The roof, layered with bark and more hide, did not leak. They took apart the old lean-to, beam by beam, and used the wood to build their future. Every stone in the hearth was placed by two pairs of hands. Clara, whose hands had once been soft and useless, dug the new root cellar herself, earning blisters that turned to calluses, badges of a new kind of pride. Tyen carved the doorframe, inscribing small, intricate patterns along the edge. Not the symbols of his tribe, or of hers, but something new, something that was only theirs. When it was finished, when the house was ready to hold more than just survival, Clara took a scrap of smooth pine. With the tip of Tyen's knife, she slowly, carefully carved letters into its face. Home of Clara and Tyen, where no one is left hanging. She nailed it above the door herself. It was late that summer when they found the boy. They had ventured deeper into the woods than usual, searching for a wild beehive Tyann had spotted. Instead of buzzing, they followed the sound of crying, a thin, desolate sound that was almost lost in the rustle of the leaves. Beneath the wreckage of an overturned wagon, half buried in debris, was a boy no older than 5. His clothes were rags, a dark purple welt stood out on his temple, and his eyes were so wide and full of terror, they looked like they belonged to a very old man. He didn't speak for 3 days. They brought him home. They cleaned his wounds. Clara fed him warm broth, spoonful by spoonful, just as Tyann had fed her. They let him sleep by the fire, wrapped in the softest fur they had. Tyann gave him space. Clara gave him words, simple, safe words. Fire. Blanket. Water. Safe. On the 4th morning, he was sitting by the fire, watching Clara knead dough. He reached out a small, trembling hand and touched her arm. He whispered a single word, "Anina." Clara froze. The word was Comanche. It meant mother. Later that week, Tyann was trying to fix the boy's only possession, a broken wooden toy wheel. The boy, watching him, mumbled another word. Pana. Tyann's hands stilled. He looked at the boy, and a slow, gentle smile spread across his face. It was the first true smile Clara had ever seen from him. Pana, he repeated softly. Father. They never asked where he came from. They never pressed him for the horrors he had seen. It was enough that he stayed. It was enough that eventually he laughed. He learned the English alphabet as Clara drew it for him with charcoal on pieces of smooth bark. He sat between them at every meal, and sometimes in his sleep, he would cry out names they did not know, and one of them would go to him, sit with him until the nightmares passed, and lead him back to the quiet shores of sleep. They planted corn that year. The stalks grew crooked and stubborn, but they grew. They built a pen for 2 scrawny chickens a traveling trader gave them. On warm nights, they would sit outside under a blanket of stars so thick it felt like you could reach up and touch them. The boy, whose name they learned was Little Owl, would nestle between them, and Tyann would point out the constellations, giving them the names only his people knew. In time, word of the house on the ridge spread. Travelers passed through. Traders, wanderers, men and women running from something. Some stayed for a night, sharing stories by the fire. Some left behind seeds or a piece of news from the fast-changing world. All were fed. All were given a safe place to rest. The house became more than a shelter. It became a sanctuary, a place where no one was hunted. No one was abandoned. No one was judged by the color of their skin, the God they prayed to, or the weight of the name they carried. And every morning, as the sun crept over the trees, that small wooden sign above the door would catch the light, its carved letters a quiet, defiant blessing. Home of Clara and Tyann, where no one is left hanging. The years flowed by like the stream at the bottom of the ridge, sometimes a trickle, sometimes a flood, but always moving forward. They carved soft lines into Clara's face and wove silver into Tyann's long black hair. The house remained, though the roof was now patched in a dozen places and the garden grew more wild mint than corn. Robins built a nest in the eaves. Smoke rose from the chimney every morning, a signal to any weary traveler that here was a place of rest. The faded sign above the door never cracked. Little Owl grew into a man, tall and strong, with Clara's easy smile and Tyann's quiet eyes. He married a girl from a settlement downriver and built his own cabin a few miles away, but he came back often, bringing his own children to see their Ina and Pana. One autumn, when the hills were ablaze with color, a different kind of visitor arrived. They weren't lost or hungry. They came on strong horses, their boots polished to a high shine, their coats buttoned tight against a wind only they seemed to feel. They were government men. They brought maps and promises, unrolling crisp paper plans on the porch table. A rail line, the eldest one explained, tapping the map with a gloved finger. A great artery of progress set to run right through their ridge. "This land will serve the country, ma'am," he said, his words clipped and practiced. "We can offer you a fair price, of course. Progress, you understand, is coming one way or another." Clara stood in the doorway, her hands dusted with flour from the bread she was baking. Her back, though stooped with age, was ramrod straight. Her eyes, though softened by time, were sharp and clear as glass. She didn't answer right away. She just turned her head slightly, gesturing with her chin toward the house behind her. That roof, she said, her voice calm and steady, was stitched together after a war. Those walls were built with hands that learned how to stop bleeding and start building. The men exchanged impatient glances. This home, she continued, turning her gaze back to them, was not built on a piece of land. It was built on grief, and it was built on grace. We won't be selling that. Tyen emerged from the house to stand beside her. He was silent, as always, his shoulders still broad beneath his worn leather vest. He didn't look at the government men. He looked past them, at the trees he had taught his son to climb, at the garden where his grandchildren pulled carrots from the earth, at the path leading to the stream, a path worn smooth by the feet of their family. Then he looked at Clara, and he nodded. The men didn't stay long. A week later, a new sign appeared at the start of their path, hammered into the ground right where the wild roses grew. Tyen had carved the wood. Clara had painted the letters. Not Indian land, not white land, just loved land. And beneath it, in smaller, careful script, we already found what we were looking for. The house on the ridge became more than a home, more than a refuge. It became a story, a legend whispered around campfires and in far-off towns. Wanderers still came, lost men, runaways, girls with ghosts in their eyes, a boy with a terrible burn scar across his cheek, a woman who had buried too many children. Each one arrived with nothing but their own brokenness, and each one was fed, given a bed, and taught something simple and whole: how to stitch a tear, how to fish the stream, how to find the North Star. Some stayed for a season, some for a lifetime, some healed and moved on, but all of them remembered the light from the windows, and the quiet couple who never asked who they were before they arrived. Clara still kept herbs drying by the hearth. Tyen still carved birds in the evenings, though his hands had begun to tremble. On warm days, they would sit under the old oak tree while their grandchildren played, and they would tell stories, some true, some softened by the grace of time. And every night, when the house was quiet and the fire burned low, Clara would lie beside Tyen, their bodies curved to fit the shape of the long years between them. She would rest her hand on his shoulder, her fingers brushing the faint ridge of old scars, and she would whisper the same words into the darkness. "You gave me back more than a home. You gave me a life." And Tyen would murmur something low in reply. Not words usually, just a sound that meant yes, a sound that meant I know, a sound that meant thank you. They never left that ridge. And the story goes that long after they were gone, the house still stood. Travelers would find the path, worn smooth by generations of feet. They would see the sign, its letters faded but clear. Not Indian land, not white land, just love land. And some of them, it is said, would weep, because in a world full of borders and blood, someone had chosen instead to build a home out of mercy, out of memory, out of love. If this story touched something quiet and aching in you, if you felt the weight of Clara's courage, the depth of Tyen's silence, and the sacred beauty of a home built not by blood, but by choice, then you found your people here. Out here in the dust and distance, we tell tales that are more than just stories. They are maps of the human heart. They are stories of redemption, of loyalty in lawless places, of hands held in the aftermath of heartbreak. Stories where love doesn't ask for permission, it just stays. If you believe that even the most broken ground can grow something whole again, if you believe in a love that defies borders, history, and hate, then don't just move on. Ride with us, hit that subscribe button, and share this story with someone who still believes in second chances. Because out here, love is never easy, but it's always worth it.